Hello, and welcome to this week's edxi takeover. This week I was asked to do a social media takeover of Debt Free Justice's Instagram page. If you're tuning in, I'm hoping you had a great day at work or not. If you don't work, and yeah, I just am here with a good friend and comrade of mine, Amita Swadhin. And yeah, just let's get into this conversation. Amita, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming and sharing. And yeah, it's always an honor to share space with you.
I mean, back at you, friend.
So yeah, it's Trans Awareness Week. I guess, what is your experiences growing up as a gender nonconforming person? Are there any risk factors that you feel like you fell under? Yeah, and like how do you think that relates to like the kind of the week that we're trying to highlight in terms of like hardships and like transphobia and what does it all mean?
Big questions all at once. Well, I guess first I should let people know that right now and for the past 6 years, my work primarily is anchored in this organization that I founded and I co-direct, Mirror Memoirs, and that's the logo behind me. And we are a national storytelling and organizing project specifically intervening in rape culture by uplifting the stories, knowledge, leadership, and healing of Black, Native, and of color LGBTQI childhood rape and sexual assault survivors, very specifically. And I know that's a mouthful in and of itself, but my entry point into that so-called work is just really about wanting to get as liberated as possible myself and realizing that I needed my mirrored survivor community members in order to build the world that we need, right? It's not a one-person job. And for me, my personal story is I'm a survivor of 8 years of childhood rape within my childhood home by my parent, my father specifically. And I was a very visibly gender nonconforming child. I'm non-binary and I'm femme, and so my gender presentation can look really different on any given day, depending on my spoons and who I'm around and where I'm going. But as a really small child, my mom, who is also, my parents are both immigrants from India, but my mom was raised here from middle school onwards. And so she was pretty liberal around like not policing my gender presentation. And so she let me wear what I wanted to wear. And so I'm the oldest child in my family, and I was really vocal with my mom about, I want to get my hair cut at the boys' barbershop. I mostly hung out with little boys in my neighborhood who were my age, and we like raced our bicycles or our tricycles around, and I was always climbing trees, and I never wanted to be in like uncomfortable shoes. I definitely never wanted to be in dresses. I was mostly in sweats and Velcro sneakers and things I could get dirty in. And I never wanted to be a boy. I never felt like a boy. I never identified as a boy. Certainly at 4 years old, I didn't know that there are more than two genders. And if someone had maybe explained that to me, I might have understood myself a lot earlier in life. But I definitely knew I was different than a lot of other girls. Mostly I got called a tomboy. I wore a lot of overalls, and I'm a kid of the 80s, so a lot of Oshkosh bagash for my fellow 80s kids out there. And then I think mainly I understood my gender to be different than other girls, especially when my younger sister was born. We're 4 years apart, and she is very cisgender, very heteronormative, and was that typical stereotypical girl where she wanted the Barbies and she wanted the princess hat and she wanted to play in her party dresses and her little patent leather shoes. And I was very protective of her, because I think, femininity in general is very attacked. It's very a vulnerable place within the patriarchy, but she made a lot more sense, I think, to other kids and adults around us than a kid like me. And so I was definitely like, allowed to present myself the way I wanted to by my mom. I was lucky in that sense, but I was definitely also different than a lot of the kids around me. And that definitely played into my father targeting me for sexual violence and not my sister. I think it's a number of factors. It's never usually only about your gender presentation. It can also be in mixed race people's families. Often violence comes towards the more racialized child from the family members who are closer to whiteness, right? It can be your vulnerability of sexual violence can be about disability. If you are a physically disabled child or a deaf child within an abled household or a hearing household, right? Any marker of difference is going to make a child more vulnerable in our white supremacist, cis hetero patriarchal capitalist society. For me, growing up with two parents who were Indian American, who were both my biological parents, with a sibling who is my full-blooded sibling, the main difference is that I'm 4 years older. I do think birth order had something to play with it, but also definitely that my dad commented on my gender nonconformity a lot. And that like during the acts of violence that he inflicted on me, that would sometimes be part of his conversation while acts of violence were happening to me, while he was doing violence to me. So, I think about that a lot as someone who is now, in my mid 40s, and I've been in the movements to end child sexual abuse and sexual violence since I was like 18 or 19. And I also have a little bit of a policy and research background. And, what I've been shocked by over the last 20 years is understanding how much information is actually out there by full-time researchers, right? PhDs, academics who are just in data collection and data analysis all day long, that we as organizers don't use to the full capacity as I would like to see us using it. So I know I've said a mouthful that's like from a really personal place, but I just want to say like the way I tie my own story into the work I'm doing is first and foremost through an American Academy of Pediatrics study, which like laid me out when I read it. I was in the basement of my graduate school late at night trying to write a paper about, I was in grad school maybe about 15 years ago almost. And I was wrapping up a theater project called Secret Survivors that I co-produced with an off Broadway show. I'm originally from New York City and Northern New Jersey. And we had put together a show called Secret Survivors, featuring me and 4 other survivors of child sexual abuse in our adulthood now, looking back and telling our stories. And we had what I thought was a really diverse cast. We had a trans man, we had non-binary people, we had a straight cis white man, we had people of color, Black people, myself, right? But what we didn't have in the show was any trans women. And just as we were wrapping up a like filmed version of the show, and I had just co-written with Sarah Zatz, the director of that show, a toolkit so that it could be an educational guide. Right around that time, when everything was already in post-production, the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2012 dropped a study that says that gender nonconformity is actually a risk factor for child sexual abuse. And I remember reading that study and it just took me out. It just hit me in such a like gut punch, personal kind of way, because it helped me put language to something that the story I shared with you when we first started this call is something I couldn't have articulated before reading that study, right? I didn't understand that like, I'm not queer and non-binary because I was raped as a child. I was likely targeted through the act of rape and sexual violence because I stood out to this predator in my family because I am gender nonconforming. And that was like inverting the whole homophobic, transphobic narrative of our society, right? That those of us who are survivors of sexual violence, I think are often taught to think that like, maybe you're that way because you're damaged goods, right? That way being queer or trans. And it's like, no, everybody, from the American Academy of Pediatrics, a very mainstream data source, right? They are telling us 10 years ago that gender nonconformity is a risk factor for child sexual abuse. That study specifically said that assigned male at birth children are up to 3 times likelier to experience sexual violence if they are gender nonconforming, and assigned female at birth children are up to 60% likelier if they are gender nonconforming to experience sexual violence. 10 years ago, right? So like for me in the like post Me Too era, this should be a data point at the tip of everyone's tongue, at the tip of everyone's keyboard fingertips. And yet here we are where like Mirror Memoirs is one of the only organizations that is constantly lifting this reality up. And for me, one thing I was really excited about with your Instagram takeover is like when we talk about young people and we talk about the different ways that systemic and cultural violence is happening to certain groups of young people, we absolutely need to add this layer to the conversation.
Wow. Yeah, that was definitely a mouthful, and definitely a lot to process. And it has me thinking about so many things. I think like your analysis is so important regarding cutting through even the ideas of visibility, like I think like the analysis helps to identify that like we're already as visible as we like, despite like our inclination to try to hide like parts of ourselves. For me, growing up gender nonconforming, I really did the best I could to hide like any sort of abnormalities, let alone femininity, as like a designated male at birth, what have yous. And yeah, just naming that like it is your differences that make you a target. So I think it does challenge like ideas and demands for like more visibility, when actually like, we have to look at how the reasons why we're have historically been targeted, not only by some like predatory people, abusive people, but also like by the state. And I always like to identify to people who have some of these like very like really interesting biases against trans and gender nonconforming people, specifically towards the feminine trans and gender nonconforming people, is where did that come from? Where did you learn that from? And it has so many ties to the kinds of anti cross-dressing laws, obviously, but the kind of criminalization that a lot of people before us have experienced, down to I think because Wakanda and Black Panthers is a thing, and how like in the first Black Panther they were talking about like how the FBI or CIA can like targets and destroys particular governments or communities, is like taking out some like really important cultural significant figures within specific cultures. And I really do think that when it comes to Indigenous people, Black people, people of color globally, that we were targeted, specifically, yeah, Two-Spirit, trans, LGB, queer people, gender nonconforming people, because there were specific like roles that we provided to our communities, really significant roles regarding like, yeah, like care, from care work to medicine to spiritual practices. So much of that has been demonized, and then not only socializing those kinds of demonizations, but institutionalizing it. So it like exists on and on, definitely within the institutions, but also like even if we are kind of, getting rid of said institutions, or even changing laws, legislating, certain things, you can't necessarily like legislate the hate away, or you can't legislate social dynamics. It takes a little bit more. Yeah, so I just think that your perspective just brings so many things up. Just from just thinking about, yeah, being younger, and like it was often being, so very feminine, and not always feminine presenting, and being excluded because of that, or having, certain, usually for me, certain men kind of identifying that femininity in me, and punishing me for it. And there's like this link between, punishment and like normalization, and like criminalization, and excluding, people from specific resources. Can you talk more on that, on like those kinds of like intersections, or like pipelines, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful that the organization that we're connected through today is about, ending the fines, right? For the fines for youth who have been criminalized, right? Like debt-free justice. That's incredibly important. And I want to honor that work. It's necessary and it's life-saving for youth who are caught up in the criminal legal system. And I hope that everyone who is engaging with this organization's work is also asking themselves, and how can we, in addition to passing the legislation needed to stop this fining practice, that we also start to build the world in which no child is even locked up, in which there isn't a carceral system to lock people in. And along with that, and I think this is what Mirror Memoirs is bringing into the conversation, the like very large scale and growing every day in a really exciting way, conversation around abolition is like, and how do we build the world in which prisons don't exist, police are not needed and don't exist, and also children are not raped, and also trans children are considered human beings and part of humanity. Like trans people have always existed, and that means trans children have always existed. And when we say we are fighting for bodily autonomy in our society, right? There's so many important conversations happening right now around, for example, reproductive justice, right? We all need to stretch our imaginations just that little bit more and broaden our analysis just that little bit more to understand that bodily autonomy also means giving children the space to show us all who they are, right? And like when a child asserts who they are, for them to all be in communities and networks of kinship and care in which they are believed, they are affirmed, they are protected, they are celebrated, right? That is the world that I am trying to build for the many children in my life. So many of my friends and comrades have had children during this pandemic time, and I think about those kids all the time. And I think about the reality of many statistics and decks that are stacked against any of those children coming into the world today who may happen to be trans, and especially those in a US context who happen to be trans and Black, or trans and Native, or trans and Black and Native, right? Like I do have to name that there is a child sexual abuse to prison pipeline. There is a child sexual abuse to poverty pipeline. These are data points that exist by wonderful research institutions like the Williams Institute here in Los Angeles County, where I live. And that's a UCLA research center. That center, the Williams Institute, and many other organizing and advocacy nonprofits have already done an excellent job in the last decade or two about raising the consciousness that 40% of all homeless young people across the United States, in major cities across the United States, 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ identified, and that over 50% of those LGBTQ unhoused youth say they are running away from abuse at home. right? So now we start to build this pipeline. When I say that there's a child sexual abuse to poverty pipeline, we know that the experience of being unhoused as a child makes you more likely to stay impoverished as an adult. We know the experience of being in foster care as a young person puts you on a pipeline to be impoverished as an adult as well. We obviously also know that specifically for Black trans people in adulthood, right? I don't have to tell you, but to name it for our listeners, right? Like, I believe the last statistic I read is that 38% of Black trans people are making less than $10,000 a year in the United States, right? And that's without the experience of childhood sexual violence that you then have to try your best to heal from in a capitalist, transphobic, white supremacist, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous settler colonial society. I mean, the deck is so stacked, right? So the layers that we have to peel back in order to build the world I was talking about, in which this violence doesn't happen anymore, and in which trans children, and especially those who are Black and Native, are celebrated and protected and believed, and their autonomy as human beings is respected. We have to start connecting these dots. And I think for me, one thing I want to also add, if I can, around, you know, the like legislation piece, like we absolutely have to legislate mandated reporting away. I feel really strongly about that. Mandated reporting was enacted in my life very much against my will when I was 13, and it was incredibly violent. White social workers, police officers, and prosecutors entered my life when I was in 9th grade. And, you know, I grew up in northern New Jersey. So for folks who might not know that, that's the largest Indian American population in the United States, like the New York City and New Jersey area. And there was a huge backlash against our community growing in such large numbers. And that backlash sort of came to a peak around the time I was in middle school and high school. And there's no way to divest that from my experience, because when white people who had state authority showed up in my living room against my will, their first assumption, and this is an actual quote from the social worker, was that we know this violence happens more in your community, and you can trust us and you can tell us what's going on. First of all, that's patently untrue, right? Child sexual abuse is happening in endemic ways at endemic rates globally. Human beings have a childhood rape problem. It's a part of rape culture that most people want to individualize and not have a systemic analysis around. Secondly, the prosecutor's line of questioning was whether I wanted my mother incarcerated for being quote unquote complicit in the violence that had happened to me. But of course, like a lot of people in my family situation, my dad was violent towards my mother as well as towards me and my sister. Right. So what my mother needed was support. She was economically dependent on my father. She needed economic resources to be able to leave him. She needed a community that was going to support her and believe her and help keep him away. And she got none of that. She got the threat of incarceration. So I'm no believer in mandated reporting. Let me just be really clear. My vision of abolition absolutely includes abolish mandated reporting. It includes abolish state-funded psychiatric institutions, because those are jails, especially for poor people, disabled people, trans people, foster care people. Like that's all jails. And I just want to say, those of us seeding abolition and abolitionist reality need to also contend with something that's really clear to me as the child of immigrants from a South Asian subcontinent. My family specifically is from an upper caste Hindu lineage from like 3 different places in South Asia. And without getting too specific about things that are well beyond the purview of this conversation, you know, caste violence is very real in our diaspora. It's super real and relevant in the subcontinent right now. There's genocide happening and has been happening for thousands of years against Dalit people, who are outside of and socially stratified. The stratification, they're the lowest in the caste system stratification. There's genocide happening against Muslim people as well by the state of India. And within that context, I think I'm really clear that there is something about the ruling caste, the Brahmins in that society that my family comes from on my dad's side. There's a religious book called the Code of Manu that roughly dates back 2,200 years. So pre what we think of in the United States as like European contact and the beginning of colonization, right? Like when you look at that scripture, the Code of Manu is what codified the caste system, and for upper class families, it also codified a particular rape culture kind of patriarchy. In that code, it says that when a girl child is born, right, a girl child, an assigned female at birth child, I'm just going to use that because that's what the text says. She is the property, and that's the word it says, property of her father. And then he has the authority and free will to marry her off to whoever he wants, like a pawn, like a piece of chattel that you would trade to make a business deal, or like make a relationship go better with a family that you want an alliance with. And then she belongs to her husband as his property. And if she should outlive her husband, but she has a son, she is the ward of her oldest son. The person that she gave birth to, she can't even inherit her own titles, property, nothing, right? It all belongs patriarchally to the men around her. And so that is the lineage that I come from. I am super clear that even in the United States context, if we abolished the state tomorrow, but I still lived on this land and I was still socially connected deeply to the Indian American diaspora that I was raised within in the largest South Asian population in the United States, Brahminical patriarchy as a value is still there, right? Like our vision of abolition has to include the abolition of patriarchy. It has to include the abolition of rape culture. And these things are interwoven deeply. It has to include the abolition of the blood family as the only legitimate network of kinship and care. I call that blood supremacy, right? When we're reliant on, or we have the imposition of family that we're related to by blood being the only recognized, the only socially legitimate and legible source of kinship and care and authority is our blood ties. And what does that mean for me, who was raped by my father, my literal father, for years of my childhood? I reject that notion strongly. And the reality is, if we look at my story against the backdrop of the data of other gender nonconforming kids, I'm not the only one who was raped and abused by the people who made me. It's actually a really common story. And I don't think that we can only blame the colonization that happened in a US context on that. Because we have an audio archive in Mirror Memoirs of 73 queer, trans, intersex, non-binary, quote, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color child sexual assault survivors. And there are many people in that subset of storytellers who, like me, are non-white immigrants or children of immigrants to this country from the African continent, from the Asian continent, for example, who speak to very parallel experiences to mine. That, like, there are things, it's uncomfortable to say, because it would be nice to blame the white supremacist state and empire for everything bad that's ever happened to me. But the reality is that if we just focused our abolitionist movement and politics on only abolishing the state and not taking a really honest look at what needs to change in our blood ties families as well, we're not going to achieve that reality where all children, especially trans children, especially trans, Black and Native and of color children, are safe, revered, protected, respected, right? Like there were problems in our pre-colonial societies, and my family's example is a great example of that. So it's like, yes, abolish the state, and we can no longer have simplistic narratives of all families need to stay together, right? Like states need to have nothing to do with decisions on what families stay together and what families don't. But the reality is my family needed to break apart. My family needed to break apart on our terms, meaning my terms, my mother's terms, my sister's terms. But we absolutely needed to be away from my father. I got disowned from my father's family when I was 16 as retribution for me disowning my father. And nothing better could ever have happened to me, because then I was free from this incredibly patriarchal lineage. in my family. And it gave my entire family unit the freedom to remake with my story at the center as the oldest child, as a very queer person, remaking and reshaping and reteaching my family a new way of being in a network of kinship care with each other. And I learned that model that I have taught to my family from other queer and trans people of color, because I left home at 17. And I had the ability through leaving home, and, you know, I had the privilege of going to college, and I lived at college, and I met other queer and trans young people through that experience, and then continued to meet more and more queer and trans people of color as a young organizer. I became a youth organizer in New York City, mostly in Brooklyn public high schools when I was like 22. And it was like in being in relationship of all different kinds with other queer and trans people of color that I started to understand, without even having the language for it, like, we're taking care of each other. All these people were disclosing to me their child sexual abuse survivorship because I was talking about it with them. And I didn't even know that the level of data that I've shared with you today about how pervasive it is. Right. Even without the like layer of gender nonconforming kids, just in the general cis population, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys is a child sexual abuse survivor in the United States. That's a massive baseline number. That's 20% of people in the US. And then add on to that all of the disparities, all the vulnerable populations. Right. So I feel very grateful every day for my queerness, for my gender nonconformity, even though it was in many ways the root of so much violence that happened to me. It's also the gift of otherness that forced me outside of the blood family system into an alternate network of kinship and care that could hold me, and in which I could struggle with other people who were also survivors, not just of child sexual abuse, but of all this state violence, all this cultural and societal violence. And we could struggle together to figure out, okay, what we've inherited is clearly not working. How can we build something much, much better? And then, you know, I've known that I was queer and had the language for it for 24 years now. So I've been able to bring that back to my very cishet mother and my very cishet sister and my very cishet grandmother, etc. And we've actually helped raise my little brother together, who's 28 years younger than me. And I'm really grateful to say, like, we were able to raise him in a way in which, you know, I was teaching everyone, we have to ask him permission, even when he's a year and a half, before you pick him up, because he's old enough to understand what you're saying. You have to ask. And if he says no, you have to respect that. And I actually used they pronouns for my little brother until he started to assert consistently that he was a boy. You know, because I was like, I actually don't know. He's just a child. This person is a baby. So I'm going to use they and them until I know that this is the, whatever the assertion of pronouns and gender identity is coming from this child. It turns out my brother is cisgender, but I'm also very proud that that child had the space, if they hadn't been cisgender, to say it. You know, my brother grew up always knowing trans people through my community and kinship networks. That was just a different way of being in the world. And, you know, as a family, we have, I think, learned so many different ways of doing things that my family is now, my parents, my mom and stepdad, who have been together 25 years, they are the couple that other Indian American immigrants in their friend group call when one of their children comes out as queer or trans. And of course, they are coming out as queer or trans because it's 2022 and everybody has social media and, you know, well beyond Tumblr. And so the kids are all right in the sense that they know who they are. And I'm just grateful that my family now is creating a unit of supportive families where it's okay if you are in this network of care, you know, to be trans, to be queer, and to be protected in this South Asian American network, which is just vastly different than what I had when I was growing up.
And expanding that notion of, you know, what family is or means, to it doesn't have to be, you know, blood only. I think, you know, a lot of what you had mentioned regarding, you know, abolition and specific, very hot button issue politics and abolition and mutual aid have become very, very popular discourses since, you know, the uprisings and COVID and the responses to COVID by, you know, predominantly people with disabilities who, you know, have had to learn how to provide resources necessary for survival themselves for years prior to said, whopping roaring 20s. I think a lot of what you're talking about reminds me that there's this interesting adage of how much these institutions like schooling, a lot of schools really remove conversations on critical thinking, really remove conversations on consent. And it seems like very, very purposeful, well planned reasons why they don't do this. And just acknowledging like how important a lot of these conversations, and like you said, your relationship to younger people in your life, just like having that kind of like radical consent that acknowledges that children can in a lot of ways like make decisions for themselves and like have their own lives and their own experiences, and choose what kind of person that they want to be down to their very gender. And yeah, I think it's not something that is easily like when we're talking about the kind of like religious doctrines that, or even spiritual doctrines that might be coincide with patriarchal values or intentions. I think that's part of the fight. It's part of including counter narratives even to some of the things that we might have thought was like inherently just something within our families, but even pre-colonization, but might actually be abusive or might actually be patriarchal. And that's an important perspective. And yeah, just definitely the piece, like echoing the piece about needing to teach younger people, whether it is the schools that are doing it or it's just us talking about having conversations about radical consent. And I think the reasons why some of these colleges or schools are hesitant about having conversations of consent is because it can get pretty insurrectionary when thinking about well, what other things that we do not collectively consent to, whether it be rent, or whether it be having to pay for knowledge that helps us survive, or our genders, or the police or prisons. And then it untangles our very relationship to courts and the state even, and even each other. It's like if I don't consent to have a relationship with someone, whether they are blood relatives or not, based on their abuse, I shouldn't have to be in those same spaces. I think, I've experienced quite a lot of harm in and outside of movements. Part of the most disheartening things I found and reasons why I had to leave certain spaces was because I kept coming across people who didn't have to make those hard decisions that me and my sisters had to do with our abusive father, and deciding to make space, away from him, as well as the relatives that were being apologists for a lot of his abuse. And that's really hard when we're children making like very adult decisions, and like not wanting to necessarily involve the state based on being very afraid, living in Hawaii of all places, of being captured by the foster care system that was very white and very much a thing, a ubiquitous thing that we all knew, was this kind of like deputized institution that captured us and, literally trafficked us for money. And, people don't look at the foster care system or even the prison system as like an actual trafficking apparatus, and how it actually commodifies our bodies and like uses us to like, inspire entire industries. And yeah, just how violent some of these things are, but also the piece about, yeah, like, even though we did not, like you were saying, even though mandatory reporting was the reason why I actually went into foster care and didn't, need to go, based on, finally getting away from our father and finally, having that capacity to watch over one another. And both my older sisters were, we were all kind of caretaking each other, including our mother who had like her own neurodivergence, mental health problems. But I think in those times, we were okay without this kind of mandatory reporting that finally placed us into, the quote unquote care of the state. It was, and it's those kinds of experiences though that really help establish my resolve regarding how these are not fundamentally like I guess helpful or untouchable or unproblematic kind of apparatuses or systems. Like these are things that we have to be prepared for imposing, like imposing their will on us, or their like, yeah, like I said, capturing. I think that with so much of the ways that we're trying to figure out like how we're going to continue our movement work beyond the state. I think, yeah, it's just as important to acknowledge that we have within amongst ourselves, there's got to be changes that we have to make. There's got to be transforming of our social relationships, which is, exactly what mutual aid kind of is, in terms of, providing the needs and resources that we have for each other without a third larger party that is very destructive, that is very much causing our oppression at times, to then regulate us and have so much control over our behaviors, and actually confounds the kind of like, problems that you highlighted. I think yeah, I just wish, like, I wish in so many ways, like I know that abolition is, in a lot of ways, yeah, it's been very co-opted, and I think people who, there are people who definitely mean well, but I think some other people's experiences need to be a little bit more on the forefront. And like Trans Awareness Week, I'm glad like gives us the kind of opportunity to like center some of the most marginalized people within the, I guess, trans umbrella, what have you. That being, trans women of color, that specifically Black trans women, Because it's a lot to be on the intersections of Blackness, womanhood, and transness, and not get the kind of simultaneous help from all of those things. It kind of is the opposite. It's like pitting different identities against one another, or over, over one another. And yeah, I just think those kinds of experiences are really, really important, especially these days, because we're still not. Uh, the stats are in. Every year is the deadliest year. I don't know what the stats are this year, what it's going to say for this year of Trans Remembrance Day. But it is really, really disheartening. And I still feel like there's relationships that we need to have, intergender relationships that we need to have between our youth, millennials, baby boomers, and having these like these are really hard conversations to have. It reminds me of the book, edited by Aisha Simmons, Love with Accountability. Shameless plug. I I wrote in the book, and actually Amita was responsible for me being in the book, by Aisha choosing me to be the closing contributor. And like we can talk till the crows come home when it comes to abolition, and talk all day about the state, but like, what are we doing amongst each other? You're right about like the kind of harm that we've internalized a lot of these things based on our relationships to slavery, or based on our relationships to the genocide of our people, and like having to experience like poisoning of our communities, and the taking of our lands, and like devaluing of our labor, and like who we are. And that does something to a people. And it's important to heal from these things. And when I think about the youth, I really want to emphasize like finding ways like that you're already doing in terms of talking about consent, but also like expanding like conversations of consent towards larger frameworks and larger systems of harm and domination.
If I could jump in there, I think I would love to add here, like, I think sometimes, for people who are maybe listening to this and thinking, I'm outside of these identities myself, and like, the word ally gets so much play in the mainstream media. Like, I want to be an ally. What can I do? It's Trans Awareness Week. What can I do? I think sometimes the answer to that question is more, it pushes people to a place of discomfort. And I just want to say, like, part of abolition is learning to sit with the discomfort and consider what people are asking for, right? Like, of course, ally is a verb, accomplice is an even better verb, right? To be an accomplice to the trans community, it means that you as cisgender people, if there are cis people listening to this, I commend people for wanting to learn. And part of that is knowing that you can't define for our communities of non-binary and trans people what the needed actions are. So as someone within the non-binary community who's doing work with trans and non-binary coalitions all the time, let me just say that I get asked a lot by cis parents, especially, or cis people who want to become parents, or cis people who have nibblings, children in their lives, whatever, like, what can I do to prevent child sexual abuse? And in this time of the last 2 years, sadly, we have seen cis people watching almost like a passive audience, right, through the mainstream media. Since January of 2021, over 36 states, I think it's 36 states, have proposed or passed legislation criminalizing trans youth in some way, shape, or form, from trying to ban trans youth from playing sports, especially trans girls, to banning trans youth from getting healthcare, to banning certain books in schools. You were talking about schools, right? Like banning books about LGBT people and especially trans people from being in school libraries or even public libraries, right? Like there is hopefully an awareness now in cis communities that are fighting for social justice that there is genocide happening to trans children, especially Black trans girls, right? Like that's the other layer to what you're saying, is like for those who are under 18, who are at that intersection of being Black, being trans, and being a girl or being feminine, and assigned male at birth, like that's that added layer of the adultism and the violence of ageism. One thing that everybody can do, two things actually. One, stop going to gender reveal parties. If you get invited to a gender reveal party, I'm telling you now that if you identify as an abolitionist, it is your responsibility to decline that invite and explain to your friend or loved one who's inviting you why you are declining that invite. Like you have to do the work, because I guarantee you that people who are hosting gender reveal parties are not listening to me or you, edxi. They're not, right? And so like, for all of my listeners out there who get those invitations from your loved ones, and you're hearing all this data from me and edxi, you have to do that work to reshape your relational networks, to let them know something that you might have learned today. Do not go to gender reveal parties. Do the work with your loved ones to help them understand this genocide against trans kids. And then furthermore, and this is where people get uncomfortable and I get some pushback sometimes, but it's the honest truth. If you really want to live in a world in which no child gets raped, and that includes trans children, you first have to understand and accept in your heart of hearts that trans children exist, trans babies exist. I was a baby once upon a time who was a non-binary baby. I came into this world exactly as you see me now, but in a baby form. I didn't like learn my gender along the way. I just was. And I might not have had the language for it, but I still was the same spirit. And that's true for you. That's true for every friend I have and comrade I have who's trans or non-binary. And so if you really want to be an accomplice, stop the practice of assigning sex to fetuses, stop the practice of assigning sex to newborns, create space. And I'm saying this as someone who has done it, okay? I had a child in my life, in my younger sibling who's 28 years younger than me. He's kind of like my kid, of just protecting the room around him enough to say, I don't know who you are yet because you can't talk. You're a literal baby. So I'm going to use they and them pronouns for you, regardless of what your body parts look like, because I don't know what your spirit is yet, and you can't talk yet. And when you're 1 or 2 or 3, I'm going to just make sure that you have all the language in the world to know that different gender identities exist. The beautiful thing about being in relationship with babies and toddlers right now in 2022 is this is why we're having, as Imara Jones calls it, the trans lash that we're having, because so many wonderful tools have actually been created. You want to show the child in your life cartoons and age-appropriate books about gender diversity, guess what? You can do that. And half the time they're about penguins, and they're all based on reality, because nature is gay too, and nature is trans too, because we're part of nature. It's literally in every species out there. So like, do your part with an abolitionist practice of abolishing the violent genocidal practice of assigning sex to unborn fetuses and to newborn people. It is not rooted in reality. It is rooted in violence. It is rooted in the perpetuation of the nation state and racial capitalism and global patriarchy. And it needs to end truly. If you really want to live in a world in which no child gets raped, then that means no child gets raped because they are gender nonconforming and being preyed upon, because of transphobia being an undergirding value of global society. It is a global value, unfortunately, and we as human beings can reshape it. And so I just, abolition is not just about the state institutions, like you've said today. It's intertwined. The culture and the practices of how we relate with one another as people is related to the state, but it's beyond the state as well. And I just want people to be expansive when we're doing freedom dreaming
Mhm.
together. And along with that, one other thing that everybody can do is like learn your own history. Like you as a person, learn the history. And if you're like me and you're not Black and you're not Native, but you live in the United States, like USCN history is also your history now. You live here now. My brother is being raised here now. And so it's important for me as an adult in his life to also understand the intricacies of US history and not just my own people's diasporic history. So one person I want to uplift that everyone should know on this call, because it is Trans Awareness Week, is William Dorsey Swann. So this was a person who was assigned male at birth, and according to Wikipedia, they use he, him pronouns for him. I have no way of knowing William Dorsey Swann, so I will use he, him pronouns in this mini story. But he was born in 1858 as an enslaved baby and died a free person in 1925. This all took place in Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C. And in the early 1880s into the 1890s, William Dorsey Swann organized balls like ballroom balls, right, in Washington, D.C. And he called himself the Queen of Drag. He would show up to these balls in beautiful satin and silk dresses. And most of the attendants at his balls that were invite only were also formerly enslaved quote unquote men. Who knows? Maybe some of them were trans women, maybe some of them were non-binary femmes, but they were all assigned male at birth, formerly enslaved people who gathered to dance and build relationships with one another. And I want to reintroduce what you and I have been talking about, those networks of kinship and care. Our examples that we're talking about of being beyond the blood family are modeled for us well back to the literal time of freedom from enslavement for Black people in this country, right? And they call themselves the House of Swan. I mean, if this sounds a little bit like if you watch Pose and that history, it's because it is. It dates all that way back. And I want to uplift the work of Black trans scholars who have been the ones largely archiving these stories. C. Riley Snorton, Treva Ellison, Marshall Green. That's just 3 examples. We are so lucky in 2022 to have Black trans scholars who have, been able to have positions in the academy and positions as researchers, positions as archivers, so that people like you and I can share these stories through tools like Instagram, right? We have more tools at our fingertips today, everybody listening, than we've ever had before. I sound so old, but I grew up in the time of card catalogs and Encyclopedia Britannicas, and my family was lower middle class, and we did not have the newest Encyclopedia Britannica. Like if it wasn't at the 1986 version of the encyclopedia that my dad bought for me used from the white neighbors down the street, I didn't know it. I didn't know the information. And that is no longer an excuse. We all could know William Dorsey Swann's name. We all should know this person's name. We should all be thinking about when we say the blood family cannot be the building block of our society, we have models dating back to the beginning of the abolition of enslavement to be the actual foundation for what we're building in abolitionist times in 2022.
Thank you for that. I think, I think in closing, my thoughts for trans awareness and in relationship to trans youth and foster care and the juvenile justice system is, there's still so much work that we could be doing within our own communities regarding responding to specific harms that other people, have imposed on certain peoples. And, I know that, like, in my experiences, I really trying to come from a place of like practicing, transformative justice models. And sometimes, there are definitely times where transformative justice isn't necessarily possible. And you might actually have to just prioritize certain people's safety above trying to, restore or navigate specific relations. And I think there's this like really fascinating fixation on, you know, how we might be replicating systems of harm and punishment culture by simply by going against or having our own feelings when it comes to abusive people. Let's say that they're abusive people without kind of attaching the fact that they might, you know, one day heal from their own abuse and they might change their ways. But you know, I think a lot of like what we're saying might go over certain people's heads. Like I really truly feel like most abolitionists aren't where you are at or where even I'm at, especially regarding the abolition of the state. I think that is a lot more new that to people, because I think what is so pervasive right now is the abolition of the prisons, or even the police, and in the form of defunding. And yeah, I just think that, you know, defunding is an interesting tactic because it definitely, I felt, became this kind of, in my opinion, this kind of like almost professionalized call or wing of abolition. And I'm thinking like it doesn't, it hasn't, that hasn't provided like us with the kinds of tools or practices like, you know, a lot of us have had in the past, or a lot of our ancestors were doing in relationship to like, you know, leaving, you know, certain plantations behind, and you know, creating our own care networks, and not even having like any sort of books or roadmaps, and doing the thing. I think, you know, these kinds of these conversations are, yeah, they're, again, they're really difficult. And I think that I'm hoping that, you know, in all the work that people are doing regarding abolition, yeah, just like I've always like, well, not always, but just felt a very much a disconnect between what people are talking about and the things that they're doing, in legislative ways, in professionalized ways, in ways that even relate to one another, regarding the kind of social hierarchies that are so pervasive that they've become invisibilized. And you know, I think that transformation is got to be in order, because it's, you know, it's been harming us. And there's a plethora of knowledge to, you know, pull from regarding, you know, the wonderful scholars that you had mentioned, and just people's like plain old, you know, experiences. I don't identify as a scholar or an academic, and I feel like, you know, some of the challenges as a Black trans woman is being taken seriously and having to, you know, do the most to be recognized as like a whole person, and not just like, you know, something that's like fetishized or just a floating head. And yeah, like I think that, you know, for me, I think there are definitely histories that are starting to be more uncovered. And the more we're seeing these histories, the more we're finding out that we can actually do these things for ourselves, and we have every capacity, every capability, to, you know, do things on our own terms. And on the same token, I also think that like bringing up again, it isn't always just the state. Sometimes, a lot, like for me, I know that, there is a lot of transphobia in Black community. That doesn't mean that that is exclusive to Black community. Obviously, we learned it from white people, but I think important to know those kinds of nuances and like and find ways to navigate and be accomplices. And I think there's even longer conversations I can go on and on about how specifically intramurally, when we're talking about Black community, we have our own relationships to one another that might not apply outside of non-Black peoples, especially when it comes to conversations of consent. Like Sadia Hartman pointing out that our like, what does consent mean actually for Black people in an inherently anti-Black world, where we don't have a lot of agency over the kind of like the social life that allows for people to have all of these state benefits and rights and privileges, from disability, care and healthcare and all these things. There are certain people who are not afforded those things. So in my politics, which is an anti-state perspective and anti-colonial and, obviously anti-patriarchal and anti-oppressive politics, I think there is this so much focus on how there's a lot of focus on getting kind of restitutions, and I think I'm always concerned with the bigger picture of like what are the things that we're pouring so much of our focus on, that we're bloating and expanding a specific coercive power that is actually constructing the problems, and then feeding us the so-called solutions to then prolong its power and oppression over us. I'm sure other people historically, like myself, have been exhausted by this dynamic that we have with like some of my ancestors' first abusers, and us internalizing these kinds of like harms, but also like I appreciate your perspective about expanding that notion to like, yeah, like even though you might have ancestors that are tied to certain lands and things, there are still problems that exist within them. And I just think that we have to have, a lot more open conversation, and we can do more to assemble those conversations. And it's hard out there, because I think for me, the hardest thing is learning that I'm not just oppressed by way of all of the kind of social identities that I fall into, but also by, specific worldviews that I have. Most of the worldview that I have, they're not echoed or reified or affirmed by institutional power or the state. They never will be. They can't be, because when they start adopting them, it would, it would crumble. And I think there is definitely co-optation within academic apparatus. The state obviously, co-ops a lot of our very language. Like a lot of the things that people have been doing for years and years, the language has been co-opted by the government, kind of like social work apparatuses, and used in ways that aren't really principled through an abolitionist lens, or through anti-oppressive lens. And I think, yeah, we just got to get a lot more critical of like, self-critical and critical of what we're doing. And that's no easy task. You know, we're left with a lot of like hard choices. And I think I personally, I get a lot of like flack or whatever based on having such a hard I guess feelings towards like voting or like reform or even nonprofits. But I think I don't know. I think there's hope in that maybe people will yeah, just there might be more self-reflection and possibly people getting there. But right now I'm trying to heal from like, you know, doing so many things. But are there any things you want to close out to, any shout outs of anything you want to
Sure.
bring up?
Yeah. Thank you again for having me during this week. You know, I think everything good that happens in terms of moving society as a whole closer to freedom is done in relationship. And with that in mind, like Mirror Memoirs has really tried to construct a foundation for relationships to be formed between people that might not meet in more normative social ways because they're in very disparate positional identity groups, oppressed versus privilege, for example, or survivor versus non-survivor. And, you know, we've constructed our network in a way that's like everyone who wants to co-construct a world in which children don't get raped is welcome to join us. And we do have a member support fund in which we collect resources from the more privileged people in our network to distribute to specifically trans, non-binary, and intersex, Black, Native, and of color child sexual abuse survivors who apply because they need usually money for very basic things like rent or food or medicine or pet care for their emotional support animal or transportation. And we give $500 grants, and we have a waiting list right now of 50 people. So we do have a campaign out there. If you are wanting to give money, and you're listening to us and saying, I'm not sure what I can do, and you're not connected to people who are putting up direct mutual aid asks, that's really who our campaign is aimed at, like folks who don't know how to plug in through existing relationships. I think all the time about the statistic of how many cis people say they just don't know a trans person. So here's a great way to plug in. It's tinyurl.com/support with the capital S, trans with the capital T, survivors with the capital S. So tinyurl.com/support trans survivors. And then we're on Instagram as well at mirror.memoirs. If you want to join our email list, you can take the member survey in the link in our bio. And really, I hope that our network can be a way for folks, like I said, to plug in who maybe don't have those personal existing relationships, but are like, I'm down with what you all are talking about, Amita and edxi, like what's my entry point so that I can deepen this analysis and deepen these relationships. So thank you
that
again.
link will also be in the description of this video. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your powerful work and words and everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Stay dangerous, everyone. Thanks.